So I'm here then to introduce just some ideas, some thoughts on this idea of the body as mediator, in particular, the work of Merleau-Ponty as it meets with mindfulness, in particular in the Western kind of secular context, and the digital life world as well. So let me go into what I would like to cover. I'll say a little bit about mindfulness. I'll explore how does this fit with Merleau-Ponty, and I'll spend a little bit of time on that. And then why does this matter? Why is this important? So first of all, I'll say, well, actually, we can maybe reposition mindfulness through the lens of Merleau-Ponty. And then lastly, quite briefly, but this will then open into our discussion, I will talk about why this matters in terms of sort of the digitally mediated life world that we all live through, I think, at this time. So mindfulness, again, for this presentation, I'm looking from the, I'm interested in the popularity of mindfulness as a practice, as a concept, if you can call it a concept, as a practice and as a human capacity, the popularity in Europe and in the Western world in particular since the last 2-3 decades. Of course, the background to mindfulness has a much longer history in Buddhism in particular. But for this presentation, I'll just introduce John Kabat-Zinn's definition is, I think, a good one. Paying attention, or the awareness that arises through paying attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally. So, and this from the Buddhist monk Gunaratana. I love this very simple, definition, if you like. Mindfulness is an alert participation in the ongoing process of living. That for me is really, really great. And I'll say more about this. But just to say, it's helpful to distinguish what mindfulness means, different types of things. So mindfulness is a practice, and we're going to do a short practice together, if that's okay, in a moment. Mindfulness is a practice that we can do. It's maybe a state. It's also a capacity. So, and these are linked. So the more we practice mindfulness practices, whether that's formal meditation or maybe more generally, like in our day-to-day lives, that's called our informal mindfulness. The more we practice, the more we cultivate our capacity to be mindful. And this can be measured, and it's lots and lots of empirical research on all of this. So my interest here is broadly thinking about mindfulness, living mindfully as a way of life. So I just give a definition. This is in my MA thesis. Living mindfully as a general comportment towards the world, deliberately paying attention with openness and curiosity towards one's direct present moment experience throughout one's life. And it's really important to say then, living mindfully is paying attention openly to our experience. So we don't need to use the word, for this topic, we don't need to use the word mindfulness. And as we will see, with Merleau-Ponty, maybe mindfulness is probably definitely not the most helpful word. So I like to talk about presence, being present. These also are limited and maybe have certain connotations, but we're dealing here with paying attention. We're dealing here with awareness, open awareness, with presence. And so it's important to say this because sometimes if we talk about mindfulness, people have a very specific idea of a particular Buddhist concept or a particular kind of more secular practice with particular formats of 8-week programs or whatever. People have, and maybe they like mindfulness, maybe they don't, but actually from a curious philosophical or generally human perspective, well, whatever you think about mindfulness as a thing, if you can call it that, capital M, mindfulness, we have this basic idea of paying attention. And this idea of attention being important and actually cultivating our qualities of attention. What do we pay attention to moment to moment throughout the day with this stuff? But also how are we paying attention? Is it with curiosity? Is it with openness? Is it as I don't know if it was Oye-san or someone else talking about passive versus active, etc. So I think this is just setting the scene that both mindfulness and presence seems particularly relevant in the smartphone era, in the digital era. The idea of the attention economy, something I've written about in several other essays. So I'm interested to locate, if you like, this general idea of living mindfully within Western philosophy. But before doing that, I'd like to just guide a very short practice, 2 or 3 minutes together, if you're happy to do that. And again, this will be a mindfulness practice based on teachers like John Kabat-Zinn, you know, in the kind of who has teachers who are Buddhist and yogis and so on, but he's packaging mindfulness for the kind of Western audience. So I'd like to guide you through just a simple practice around paying attention. So just for a couple of minutes, encourage you just to ensure you're sitting comfortably just now, your feet flat on the ground. If it's possible to bring a straight posture through the back, but also just relaxing the shoulders, relaxing the arms. And just for a couple of minutes, you may wish to close your eyes. If you prefer, you can have your eyes open, just looking in front of you. And just taking a moment to let go of thinking, let go of the agenda for today or concepts and things that may be going on. And in particular, just come to notice what's going on in the body, what body sensations are there just now. How does the body feel sitting here? Noticing the weight of the body. How does the body feel its weight against the chair or the ground supporting us? And just for a few moments, bringing your attention to the sensation of breathing and drawing your attention down into the belly, the lower part of the upper body. For a few moments, seeing if we can just pay attention openly to how the breath feels. And expanding your awareness again to encompass the whole body, breathing body, sitting here, fully present, and bringing that presence to the rest of our discussion and time together. And so with that, whenever you're ready, opening your eyes again if you've had them closed. Okay. Conscious of time, so I'm just going to continue here. So with that kind of experiential, very short experiential practice there, you know, where might we locate sort of living mindfully? So, and again, I'll just say, maybe it's useful just to say quickly, in the kind of mindfulness world, the distinction is made between formal mindfulness practice, which would be meditation. Of course, that was a very, very short meditation, but this is formal mindfulness practice. And then informal mindfulness practice is paying attention to your present experience, whatever you're doing when you go for a walk outside, not being just on autopilot or caught up in your thoughts, but really noticing, listening to sounds, smells, seeing what's around you, when you're washing your hands, just noticing the sensations, small things. This would be termed kind of informal mindfulness practice, if you like. And of course, the more you do meditation, the easier then it is to practice informally, but also the more you do informally and it's part of your life, the more maybe natural it is to do meditation is the idea. So you know, to go to it, I mean, phenomenology has a focus within Western philosophy. Phenomenology is very interested in what is our immediate everyday experience actually like, and staying with that, and of course bracketing out our beliefs, our assumptions, or overly you know, not imposing theorizations and abstractions. So as I put here, you know, an interest in really being open to the world and describing the world before rushing to explain it, which philosophers in analytical traditions and also social scientists and others in life will readily do very quickly. So if we look at phenomenology as our kind of natural place for mindfulness, of course, there's many contenders. I've got thoughts on, I'm not well read as others here will be on Heidegger, Husserl. I mean, I have read, of course, around these thinkers, and I've got thoughts on this, but I'm going to maybe save that for the discussion if people are interested. Oh, maybe Heidegger's more natural for mindfulness, or Husserl, or I'm, as you know, going to go with Merleau-Ponty. One thing just I will say, mindfulness teachers in this kind of secular world often talk about the doing mode versus the being mode. Doing mode is when we're normally caught up being very busy in our lives, a little bit like Nicholas was mentioning, the activity of the mind as well. And the being mode is kind of just being with the breath, just being with our actual experience. And this is a useful distinction. Another distinction which I sometimes use is between the conceptual mode and the perceptual mode. And as you might kind of look at, you know, looking at these two different framings, and of course, again, conceptual is how we spend a lot of our days, typically when we're working, when we're doing things and in our thoughts. And then of course, perceptual is more the mindful living approach of just actually noticing, you know, attuning to what's going on. And I think even with the doing being split, Merleau-Ponty is a very good, is the best candidate for mindfulness. But of course, Heidegger may seem quite particularly relevant for the doing being split. I still think Merleau-Ponty's a better fit, we can discuss later. But certainly I think with the conceptual versus perceptual, again, that's maybe a framing which points to Merleau-Ponty perhaps, but again, we can discuss this as we go through. So let me go into the kind of substance then. So I'm going to look at whether living mindfully could be a way to live Merleau-Ponty's phenomenological worldview. So let's look at that now. So at a very, very, very basic level, a couple of things. I mean, with much of phenomenology, there's some kind of interest in the present compared to the past and the future. Of course, there's interest in all of these, but with phenomenology and our actual experience, if you're interested in our immediate experience, well, that tends to be in the present. And Merleau-Ponty notes that the present enjoys a privilege over past and future for that kind of obvious reason. Merleau-Ponty also mentions the attentiveness and wonder needed for the phenomenological project to begin with, and also the demand for awareness again. So these words, awareness and attentiveness, of course, are very, very linked with, and wonder, very linked with the basic idea of practicing mindfulness, bringing that into our lives. But what I'd like to do is, those are kind of high level things. I'd like to look at 4 particular themes that we can explore a little bit more detail. What are the connections then? How can I persuade you that Merleau-Ponty and mindfulness kind of fit well together? And again, just to be clear, Merleau-Ponty didn't present a systematic ethical system. So Merleau-Ponty presents a way of seeing the world, with attentiveness to our actual experience. But he didn't, set out, understandably, an ethical system. And so maybe we can think about living mindfully as at least part of what an ethical system, maybe system's the wrong word, maybe ethical is the wrong word, but how we can live kind of inspired by Merleau-Ponty's philosophy. Maybe living mindfully is quite a useful way to do that. So let's have a look at these 4 areas. So the first common ground is the central place for our breathing, pulsing, beating body as important, as the center of our experience. And of course, this photo is from Dorothea Lange, and I talk about Dorothea Lange in one of the essays that I've sent, or that I can share later. But so I won't say much about Merleau-Ponty and the body, because he's famous for being, in Western philosophy, the person who most put the body at the center of an entire philosophical system. But here he's saying the body is our general medium for having a world. The body is our starting point. And in mindfulness too, there's, as we just explored, that was very typical. There's an emphasis on our embodied awareness in, so this formal practice. But also, mindfulness teachers in the West will say, when you're washing the dishes, when you're going for a walk, when you're having a conversation with someone, notice what's going on in the body. Notice what you're seeing, what you're hearing, your kind of present moment experience. So I think mindfulness as practice emphasizes very much this embodied awareness. And so this is where, perhaps mindfulness is not necessarily always the most helpful word. So Jack Kornfield, a kind of American Buddhist writer, talks about when we cultivate mindfulness, we develop the ability to come to the life of the body. That for me is a very helpful and important framing of what we're doing when we practice mindfulness. It's very different, and I'll come on to say this later, it's quite different from how mindfulness is often presented in the West. So I'll say a bit more about that. And in Zen, it's from Shunryu Suzuki. He's talking about sitting with a particular posture for Zazen, for Zen practice. But that posture is not kind of, doing something, in order to then do the main event, which is something more mental. He says to take this posture is itself the purpose of the practice. Again, so there's an appreciation there of the lived body at the center of things. So that's the first common ground. The second is the mystery of our experience, the mysterious nature, and the ineffability, which means, where we cannot, explain it in words, the thisness, suchness of our experience. So Merleau-Ponty, Merleau-Ponty talks quite often about the thisness of what we perceive, or he talks about the roseness of a rose. His point is that concepts, analysis, words will never be a substitute for what it is to perceive, this object in front of me or anything else. And mindfulness teachers as well often talk about the thisness of our experience. It's like this, and we can't say more than that. Again, just quickly from Merleau-Ponty in Phenomenology of Perception, He talks about a shadow passing or the creaking of branches have each a meaning. Themselves, in themselves, they carry their own meaning. And this is then very much kind of related to this other common thread here, which is in Zen and in Zen, but equally this is taken up and borrowed in secular mindfulness traditions, this idea of beginner's mind. So beginner's mind, maybe everyone here already appreciates, is engaging with things and our experience as though each one was for the first time. When we focus on the breathing, we could really notice the breath as if it was the first time we'd ever noticed the breath. We could do that every time we meditate. We could choose to do that. And similarly, Merleau-Ponty, actually quoting Husserl, but Merleau-Ponty also uses this phrase that the philosopher is the perpetual beginner. And I love this. This is, for me, gets something very, very fundamental about what Merleau-Ponty saw as his project, or the phenomenological project, not his project, but this idea of we're always a beginner as a philosopher, as a human, as a person being in the world, etc. This is very different from intellectuals, whether philosophers or literary critics or social scientists, who seek to build knowledge, and for them, the idea of being perpetual beginner would feel like a failure or feel unsuccessful. This is not the perspective from Merleau-Ponty or from Zen or from mindfulness. And there's a quote here about the mystery entailed in meditation, but just because of time, I'm actually going to skip through this one. We can come back to that. I'm going to go quite quickly through this one, being in the world and seeing the whole. Again, another common ground for mindfulness practice or living mindfully in Merleau-Ponty. So being in the world, of course, is Heidegger's term, which Merleau-Ponty takes up, and I think it's very helpful. So Merleau-Ponty says the cogito must reveal me always in a situation. I'm never isolated from the world. Similarly with mindfulness, a kind of phrase that's often used is meet yourself where you are. This applies both in terms of your, if you like, this is maybe unhelpful, but inner experience. If you find you're very distracted, you're very agitated, you may be very angry or upset, and you do mindfulness practice, it's okay, accept this is how I feel, this is how my situation is just now. Nonetheless, I'm going to just be with it and notice it with kindness, and notice the breathing, or notice the emotions, or notice things around me. But where we meet ourselves is always in an environment, is always in a situation. We meet ourselves in, I'm living with my wife 1 hour from London, and there's this plant here, and there's, we're always in a situation. And mindfulness practice, I think, supports awareness of our situatedness. Some people say mindfulness makes us quite, if you never practice mindfulness and you see people closing their eyes in silence, maybe it looks like a inward looking practice, but I don't think this is a fair reflection of what actually is being cultivated with mindfulness. Again, maybe this is for discussion. Quite quickly, seeing the whole, so the Gestalt, Merleau-Ponty talks about, the miracle of a totality. What we perceive is greater than just the sum of its parts. And again, with mindfulness, I understand mindfulness to be very much in this spirit of bringing an awareness, yes, to one's thoughts, but also one's emotions, but also one's body sensations and perceptions, and to do all of this at the same time often. And then the last one, this is also important, on silence. Silence was, I think, very important for Merleau-Ponty. Actually, Glenn Mazes, who I know Kazashi Sensei knows, traces Merleau-Ponty's thoughts on silence back to his early works, Phenomenology of Perception, but certainly in his later works, Merleau-Ponty seems more and more humbled and inspired by silence per se. And so he says, I mean, here, philosophy must undergo a radical turning back. It must rediscover a more primordial contact with the world. But, you know, kind of more explicitly, he says that we need to rediscover the world of silence. This feels really relevant, like in a kind of digital context, which I'll come on to. And he talks about the silent knowing of the lived body, what he calls the lived body, the silent cogito. You know, when we, if you close your eyes, if you put your hands in front of you, close your eyes and ask yourself, how do I know that I'm alive? Through the sensation in my hands just now. And so you sense what's going on in your hands. You can do this. And of course, that knowledge of our aliveness through the sensation in the hands or the breath or whatever is, this is, you know, part of the silent knowing of the lived body. Mindfulness and silence, I won't say anything. I mean, I mentioned earlier, of course, practicing in silence for 30 minutes, 40 minutes, but also going on retreats for, in my case, you know, 7 days, 9 days, and of course for more committed meditators, maybe for months of silence. It's absolutely central. So I think this is worth just mentioning then. And this is a lovely photo, which is in the Perspective essay that I shared, actually by a Japanese photographer, Nobuyuki Kobayashi. And briefly on differences, this we can come to in the discussion. I'm not going to say much here, conscious of time. But the first one, of course, I just want to be really clear, actually, and before I introduce this, what I'm not presenting here is that Merleau-Ponty was really all about mindfulness. And actually, this whole mindfulness thing is really just Merleau-Ponty's ideas kind of in practice. They are, that what I've explored so far is some interesting parallels. And I'm going to say just in a moment what I think is really why that matters, and actually how Merleau-Ponty can really change how we understand mindfulness. So they're not saying the same things or doing the same things. And I just want to be very clear about that. And there are many differences. One of them, of course, is that, you know, with mindfulness, we're paying attention on purpose, noticing what's going on in the body and what we're perceiving, really doing that intentionally, deliberately. Of course, Merleau-Ponty's focus on embodied awareness was much more at the pre-reflective level. And again, I said earlier, well, the present moment seems quite important for Merleau-Ponty. Yeah, that's kind of true, but he also says here, you know, my present is, if we wish to consider it, this instant is equally this day, this year, or my whole life. And I really like that. And actually, I don't think these points negate the complementarity, the basic complementarity of Merleau-Ponty mindfulness, but it's just important to at least acknowledge them. So, conclusion so far, maybe we can think of living mindfully as a kind of silent ethics for the lived body of Merleau-Ponty, for the silent cogito as our basic kind of idea of ourselves from Merleau-Ponty. So Merleau-Ponty says we need to re-achieve a direct and primitive contact with the world. I believe that open awareness, presence, being present can really help with this. He also says it's always in the present that we are centered, and our decision starts from there. So again, maybe there's a place for something like, and again, just as a recap here, so I'm saying that living mindfully or being present means deliberately paying attention with openness and curiosity to our experience throughout one's lifetime. And this mindful decisions I'll skip over just for now. So why this matters, I'd like to draw 3 lessons for mindfulness and then 3 quick suggestions around our digital lives. So I'll do this quite quickly because of time. Because as you sensei, if I spend 5 to 10 minutes, is that okay?
Sure. Go ahead.
Okay. So apologies if we're slightly over. So why I think this matters, and I explore this in the essay you have here, the Eon essay, and again, we can share the links if you don't have them. But it's about reframing a little bit mindfulness around Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology of the lived body in particular. So lesson one so when I say lesson, this is lesson kind of for the Western mindfulness world, or Western societies, that are kind of interested in applying mindfulness in a secular kind of way. So first of all, well, let's take mindfulness as always being embodied awareness. So mindfulness can be presented in, I would say, very mind-centric ways, unsurprisingly, given the word mindfulness. So here, just like going to the gym and working out for years, you get bigger muscles, more strength. The same thing happens in the mind. The mind is a gym, and meditation is a basic workout. And so what you get with, and this is quite a kind of popular idea, and it can be helpful. I'm not saying it's totally wrong, but presentations of mindfulness like this make us think that, the body, we can exercise in the gym, and then our mind, we can exercise, and this is meditation, and this is mindfulness. We're exercising the mind and building our kind of brain muscles for attention. And it's true, we do actually build those capacities, but it can make it feel very mind-centric in an unhelpful way. So I would say instead, mindfulness or being presence is embodied awareness. I think it's helpful to appreciate that. Lesson two, mindfulness as a holistic philosophy. So in the West in particular, and I don't know about the situation in East Asia, but mindfulness-based practices are increasingly used in a kind of operational way, forms of cognitive behavioral intervention. Often mindfulness programs are targeted. This population of people suffers from anxiety or from pain, physical pain, and so this mindfulness program has been empirically found to be helpful to support this, and many other kind of applications, but they're quite targeted for specific populations with specific needs, backed up by empirical studies. And I'm not saying any of that is a problem, but what you get when I look at many papers on the empirical studies around mindfulness and its effectiveness is, the way that kind of psychologists, as in academic empirical researchers in psychology and neuroscience tend to think, is in a particular way, and it's a long way actually, often from Merleau-Ponty. So it's easy with this operational, specific, targeted application of mindfulness for specific goals, like helping people with anxiety, helping people be more creative, helping people do this or do this. It can lead to quite an analytical and quite an instrumental view of mindfulness and of what mindfulness is and what the practice is, and also for what human beings are ultimately. Merleau-Ponty, says, I can't see myself as just a bit of the world, a mere object of biological, psychological, sociological investigation. But if you read all the papers on mindfulness, you might well come away with precisely kind of that kind of conception of yourself. So instead, I think it's important, and again, I'll say, of course, with Buddhist traditions, 100%, this is not a problem. Mindfulness in a Buddhist context or in other spiritual contexts does not see the use of mindfulness as a kind of instrumental and very analytical thing. But in the West, more generally, for secular mindfulness, this is a problem. And so some scholars like Robert Gauss and Diana Koholik here talk about we should avoid the separation of mindfulness from its holistic roots. And the paper there is, I've just flashed up the kokoro, but the paper from 2011 is, it's called something like mindfulness-based practices as a holistic philosophy and method. I think that's a really helpful contribution. And just on this point, I mean, if we want to avoid that separation, and I'm thinking from a Western perspective here, kokoro, shin, etc., that will be familiar for everyone here, with that inherent unity of mind and heart and spirit. I mean, this is, as I understand it, this would be a that unity in the idea of kokoro is the starting point for Japanese thinking, for I think Chinese thinking, but this is not true in the West. To Shimura-san's point about Descartes and mind-body, Descartes did not have kokoro as his starting point. That I can say with some confidence. So I think mindfulness based around kokoro could be very helpful. That's the second lesson. Third lesson: mindfulness is inherently relational. So some critiques of mindfulness is that it's very much about the individual. It's a practice for me, and it helps me get my calmness or my stress levels reduced or whatever. But this critique, I think, misses the important point that actually practicing mindfulness is inherently relational. And actually, not only do we relate with and notice others and other beings, humans and in nature and the world per se, but we also, I think, cultivate our ability not just to passively observe, but to engage in a two-way dialogue. Now, the two-way dialogue here is very much, this is, I think, often implicit in mindfulness practices or traditions, but certainly it's very much a Merleau-Ponty kind of edition, if you like. And so I'll just quote very quickly from the Aeon essay. It's a nice nuance here from Glenn Mazes. It's not that we're all one, but that we inhabit a world in which, to quote philosopher Glenn Mazes, things, people, creatures intertwine, interweave, yet we do not lose the wonder that each is each, and yet not without the others. So I think that's a nice way of seeing our inherent relationality with others, and mindfulness is part of supporting that. And this is a photo I took near where I live, which is in the Aeon article as well, on there's an important eco-phenomenological aspect here, which I don't have time to go into. So quickly, why this matters in terms of our digital lives. So what I'll say here is just a few things which actually explored in much more detail in this particular essay that I mentioned, the What Is This essay. But the way I'd like to kind of frame this is three things to remember. Three things to remember in the digital age. So first of all, remember to breathe in the digital world. Remember that amidst everything we're doing with social media, with phones, with debates, with discussions about AI, etc. Okay, these debates can all still happen, but what does it mean to see the human being who's making this and using this and talking about this, debating this, as a breathing, pulsing, living being, as the starting point? So in particular, and why does that matter? It matters, I think, because so much of our digital world, I know this is a very broad kind of idea, but is very much something to do with concepts and ideas, opinions. Even when we talk about attention, people think of attention as the brain or the mind has certain attention, and we get sucked to social media, and can we pay attention to this instead? And it's very mind-centric. I won't read this quote, but it's there in the article. And so instead, I'm just saying, let's place our embodied being at the center of those debates. What does it mean to do that? And I can talk more later, but I explore that in quite a few places in the essay. Remember, secondly, we see what we see. Obviously tautological, but the digital world tends to operate by putting things into categories, compartmentalizing things. Your Twitter feed, your Insta feed, what you see on the news, what you see on Google. There's all the data goes in, and then they think, oh, okay, Kazashi-san seems to be interested in William James, but also coffee or whatever, and present certain things or certain stories. And as we know from engaging with this critically, we're often offered quite limited views. And so embodied presence, and in particular Merleau-Ponty's philosophy, just help us to stay vigilant against taking things too much at face value. And what I mean by that is, I mean, this is maybe not helpful, but Merleau-Ponty says actual perception alone can teach us what perception is. That's a little bit cryptic, but it's this idea that actually we need to look around, we need to engage. I'm looking out the window now, but we can perceive only through our own perception, in a sense, can we know what we perceive. And yes, of course, we still use the technology and we perceive with them and through them, and this can be very helpful. So it's not about this is a problem, but it's certainly important to know that there's something very special and mysterious about perception. And so just to say, oh yeah, I've seen this on the news. I mean, there's, you know, we need to push back against, any presentation of seeing and perceiving, which makes it seem, you know, not mysterious. And again, so remember the silent mystery of being alive. Just a question, where do we find silence in the online world? What does that mean? And again, the digital world can be driven by solutionism. I'm not going to go into detail, but this is very much covered in the essay. And it's basically the idea that, you know, everything can be presented as a problem that has a solution, and a solution in the form of data or more apps or some kind of tech solution. That's just the basic way that the digital ecosystem operates, and I explore that in the essay. And so by contrast, Merleau-Ponty and again, Embodied Presence tell us that actually the world is mysterious, but crucially its mystery defines it. So he says there can be no question of dispelling this mystery by some solution. The world is on the other side of all solutions. And just another beautiful photo from Kobayashi-san there. Okay, so I finished. Sorry for the length of time. So just on that last point about remember, I said 3 things to remember. Of course, mindfulness comes from the Pali word sati, which is often translated as remember. And this is also fitting because Merleau-Ponty notes that philosophy is not a particular body of knowledge. It's the vigilance, which does not let us forget the source of all knowledge. And so he says, true philosophy consists in relearning to look at the world. And I wonder whether we can add to that. So the first bit is him, and the second bit I'm suggesting with living mindfully, maybe we can relearn to look at the world over and over again, moment to moment, as our understanding of philosophy.